My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. The media were an active participant in the freedom movement. As India gained independence and then went on its way, the media made for a strong institutional pillar. Even during crises like the emergency, they found ways to hold their own. That's a far cry from today. When I think of the evolution of Indian news media, I divide it into phases. Post-independence, a nation finding its feet, the age of despair where the promises of freedom seemed distant, the emergency, the political churn that followed, the economic reforms, the digital revolution, and so on. Many of these I have seen firsthand in newsrooms, and many I have only read about. There would have been very few who would have seen it all themselves. So I'm truly privileged to have one such person on the show. And I'm hoping to talk about how various inflection points for the country were viewed and reported from newsrooms.
All Indians Matter.
We have on the show Rami Chhabra, who has almost 7 decades of experience in the media. She was born in 1938 and started journalism at the age of 18 when there would have been very few women in mainstream media. Ms. Chhabra's expertise in public service communication, population, women, and development has been utilized by the government, national and international NGOs and agencies such as the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations Population Fund. She's among the handful of women who broke into all-male newspaper bastions in the late 1950s, anchored regularly on Doordarshan since its inception, and has been a columnist for media houses such as the Hindustan Times, the Statesman, and the Indian Express. She created space in the media for women's issues, and her entry into Vietnam after Saigon's collapse and the subsequent 2,000-kilometer road odyssey became an internationally published scoop. Ms. Chhabra, welcome.
Hello. Good to be on your show.
Ms. Chhabra, I wanted to start with the novel you've written. It's your debut novel, Becoming the Storm. How did you think of it? What is it about? And where can listeners find it?
Well, I've had a lifetime in journalism, but I've wanted to break into fiction for a long, long time. In fact, when the National Book Trust published my memoirs, Breaking Ground, Journey into the Media and Out, which was way back in 2012, and they did a Hindi translation in a few years later, Angar Raste, Media Kshetra Mein Agwan or Alvida. I ended the book by saying, expressing my disillusionment with the media and saying, well, I hope I can now retreat to build the house of my dreams in the hills and perhaps write a book of fiction because the world has become stranger than fiction. It took me some years to get around to achieving that dream. I built the house, but then my husband was ill for some years and I didn't have the peace and tranquility in which to sit down and write. And then during COVID, suddenly, when the world got even stranger, there it was, the time to do nothing else but to sit and brood and think and write. And so I wrote Becoming the Storm. And I may tell you a little bit about the book. It's just come out last month. It's set in the Delhi of the 1950s and 60s. And it goes across several generations dealing with a Punjabi family. And then how a young woman finds her own feet and her own métier in the midst of all this changing scenarios around her. And I'm hoping that it's a book that will make its mark in present times, because it also deals with many of the issues that I have dealt with over my life, span with policy documents, statistical presentations, and now finally fiction, early marriage, domestic violence, dowry, all that figure in the book. So I'm hoping that it is as relevant today and will trigger a national conversation once again on subjects that seem to have gone into the background.
That's absolutely true. And but incidentally, I think COVID was a time when many of us discovered our creative urges. Those of us who were privileged enough to, get through the pandemic unscathed. In fact, this podcast itself is a product of the COVID lockdown. But more of that offline. But just another point on about what you said. About the topic of your book. I mean, I'm glad you wrote it because I don't think enough is written about the impact on women of great global events, whether it's the financial meltdown or the COVID-19 pandemic, and whether that's done through non-fiction or fiction. I think it's important to write about it. And I don't think enough of that happens. But Ms. Chabra, this is a good time to talk about your childhood. You were born in pre-partition India in Dera Ismail Khan, which is now in Pakistan. What was undivided India like, and what was your childhood like?
Well, I was not quite 8 when the partition took place. So my memory really is very, very childlike of that era. But what do I do remember? And it was my childhood was spent entirely in the northwest frontier. That's where my father was posted, different places from Dera Ismail Khan to Bannu to Kala to Peshawar to Rawalpindi to Karachi to Quetta finally. So that's the area that I know and remember as a very open, very green, very tranquil society full of flowers and fragrance, bird song, and and the Pathans loving, the Kabliwala thing of the Tagore play. Well, that was a reality around us at that time, and there was free intercourse between people of different religions and nationalities. And I remember someone called Sabra auntie in my childhood, someone called Majid uncle. The Britishers, of course, came and went because we were in the cantonments. So altogether, I have a very fragrant memory of childhood. And also because I was privileged to be in a family where my parents were very happily adjusted to each other. I had a childhood that gave me a great deal of stability, I think, with which to cope with life as it came eventually. So I really look back at my childhood with great nostalgia and wish more children could have had such a childhood.
And did you move to what is today India when partition happened, or were you already?
We were in Quetta when the partition took place, and while Quetta was tranquil till the 15th of August, but the inevitable basket of bangles arrived there from Jalandhar, I think, and you know that the basket of bangles always signified to the men, wear your bangles because you become women and are not able to fight. And our women are being raped and murdered, and you're doing nothing. And it became a signal wherever those basket of bangles came, this side or that side, the riots broke out. And so the riots broke out in Quetta in the 19th of August, eventually, and it was bad. We children were flown out because evacuation took place. And we came to India in the end of August itself. But my parents came later. And then it's been different schools throughout India itself.
And speaking of schools, you were not only an English honors graduate from Miranda House, Delhi University, but also studied law and sociology, which would not have been as common for girls then as it is now.
No, not at all. When I finished graduation and applied for law, believe it or not, my professors actually, who were interviewing me, begged me not to apply for LLB, but to do so for LLM, which was a year-longer course at that time and became a master's in law. And I said to them, please, for God's sake, just take me in LLB. I come from a Punjabi family. And if I complete this is more than enough. And sure enough, that's how it was. I didn't complete law. I dropped out after doing half a year because I got married and then pregnant, and it was difficult. Sociology I came to much later because I felt this lack of post-graduation education in my life and was very frustrated that I had not been able to have it. By then, my children were grown up. But I joined Jawaharlal Nehru University in sociology, And it was wonderful that I got a place. But then came the first semester exams. And the choice was to do the exams or to accept an invitation to go off to Sweden to make a film on Indian children adopted in Sweden, because I was already writing extensively. And this opportunity came. And I said to myself, well, what will I do with the sociology degree? I'm already doing the things that people do after they get their sociology. I dropped out again. So I've only done some courses, but not quite. Cannot claim to be either a lawyer or a sociologist.
Which brings me to journalism. You started as a journalist at age 18, and which too would have been unusual for a woman and at that time. And even today, in fact, we are struggling to have gender diversity in newsrooms, at least at the top. But at that time, a woman journalist, and especially someone so young, would have been quite rare.
Well, I broke into journalism serendipitously. I was still in college, and I happened to get selected for an interview with BBC on television, which was not here, but which was there in the UK at that point of time, to talk about Asian youth and our dreams and ambitions. And I found that I was talking to someone who was a world-renowned sportsman, Chris Chataway, who at that time was very famous because he had run the mile under 4 minutes, the second man in the world to do that. And when I heard that, I was not a games enthusiast, but people around me were gaga that I was talking to Chris Chataway. And so when I heard that, I said to him, may I interview you? And he was tickled pink and said, I have already given time to. And he said, for what? And I said, I mentioned the leading newspaper. And he said, well, I've already given time to the editor for a reporter, but if I will tell him that if your interview doesn't match up, I will spare time again. And of course, my interview matched up. They not only ran it, they gave me a byline, which was absolutely unthinkable in those days and in the statesmen of those days. And they ran it with a huge photograph of Chris Chataway and me. So I broke into journalism with a bang. But I have to tell you that I used that initiative to walk around to different newspaper offices, and you could do that in those days. You could walk into editors' rooms quite easily, and people, I think, were tickled pink to see a young girl wanting to write and having ideas. And within a year, I'd built quite a profile, whether it was Times of India or Hindustan Times as a statesman, or. But then, a year later, when I finished graduation, and I thought, law, or should I start working in journalism, and heard that there was a vacancy in the reporter's room in the Statesman, I went to see the news editor who was taking in my articles. As soon as I wrote one, he published it. But when I asked for a job, he said to me, Miss Aluwalia, because that was my name then, you can keep writing for us. But as far as the job is concerned, we had a woman once and it didn't work out. So we are not going to be taking any women on to our staff. And of course, we didn't have the gumption in those days to fight back as we do now. So one just beat a hasty retreat. And it was many years later that the Statesman ate its words eventually, when I had been writing for other newspapers and asked me to start a column, which I wrote then for 15 years, Woman About Town. And not only that column, I wrote a very prestigious column for the Indian Express called The Feminist Viewpoint, which was in the late 70s, which brought the women's issues into the political space. Yeah. So, I mean, it was easy at that time to break into journalism. It took a long time.
Yeah.
And by the time, very, very, very few years later, a number of women were breaking in and they were getting space. But they were wanting to beat the men at their jobs. They were talking about getting to do the crime beat or, the things that the boys were interested in. And I, by that time, had decided I also had got children by then. And I decided I didn't want a full-time job in a newspaper. So I never worked in a newsroom. But I also wanted to not only write independently, but I focused on women's issues and thought they were as political and as important as any of these other beats that people were fighting for. And so I think my kind of, what should I say, USP in journalism was that perhaps I became the first woman to really concentrate on women's issues and bring them to the fore. And that's how that eventually the Indian Express column that I just talked about also came about.
Was it a challenge working with people who were significantly older than you? You started very early, like you said, and you already mentioned how men reacted to you in the news.
Well, in many ways, I would say it was easier. They didn't want you full time, as I said, they didn't want a woman around, but they went, and also they didn't really give the kind of space and attention that women's issues needed and are now supposedly getting, and I have views on that also. But uh, when you pushed it to them, uh, you know, they were apologetic. They were almost all the editors had this attitude of, oh, how could we have overlooked this? And then wanted to, make amends and gave you the space. And, so I mean, and in many ways it became easier to break in once you had broken in than perhaps it is today when there is so much competition. On the other hand, it was very difficult to make them realize how important the issues were. I had this column in the Statesman, and the editor of the Statesman, who eventually became a very well-known human rights activist, would call me from time to time and say, Rami, but there is more to women than all this, heartbreak and this kind of constant battle that you are fighting about this issue not right and that issue not right. कभी कभी फैशन पे लिखो, कभी ब्यूटी पे लिखो, कुछ ऐसी चीजों पर लिखो जिसमें औरतें भी दिलचस्पी रखती है. So it was you did a treadmill act trying to please them on those points as well as raising issues that mattered. And I have to tell you that when I got invited to Mexico City for the first UN Women's Conference in 1975, it was amazing. Two things happened out of that, which really built up my career. But this invitation came to me, maybe because I was the only one who was really writing on women, as I said at that time. And when I looked at that invitation, one thing I did, I went to the Statesman editor and I said, can I report for you from Mexico City on this conference? And his reaction was, conference? UN conference? Which conference? What has UN got to do with women? And I said, well, it's the first UN conference on women because people like you are not realizing what has to be done for women. Okay, you can send us an opening piece. I said, there's a 3-week conference. Okay, you get important people are coming. Okay, you can do us one at the end. And before all this dialogue took place, the first thing was, we don't have the foreign exchange to give you to telex us the copy. And I said, well, I get a per diem, and I will do it from my own per diem, and you can reimburse me. We'll only reimburse you for what we've published. Please don't flood us. You can give us one for the opening. Then I argued for one in the end. And then, but it's a 3-week conference. If something happens in between, okay, at the most 3 pieces, but no more, please. They eventually published a daily dispatch because it was a highly political conference. And except for the day after the emergency, because the emergency was declared while I was in Mexico City. And I sent a dispatch saying Mrs. G's reputation stands tarnished in this August gathering, which had been looking forward to her as the apostle of women's rights. And of course, that column was spiked as soon as it came over the telex because they had already got blank pages going on newspapers at that time. So, I mean, that was one experience. And before I move away from this area, I want to tell you that it also led to what was my world scoop. You mentioned it, how I went to Vietnam and Saigon straight after the war. uh, when I got this invitation to go to Mexico City, I pulled out my children's atlas and saw that Mexico City was the other side of the world. And I said to myself, whether I go by the west or the east, the ticket is valid. And that was the time when you had these scenes of the newspapers, front pages covered with the helicopters that were taking off with people clinging to the wheels because there was no way to get out of Saigon and they were desperate. And so I went to the foreign secretary and I said, I'm going to Mexico City and I would like to stop in Vietnam en route. And he said to me, how can you want to do that? I haven't got my diplomatic bag for the last 3 months and I don't know if people are dead or alive. So what is a young woman like you doing wanting to get to Vietnam? And I said, I don't have to argue with you, sir. I've come as a journalist to ask you to simply write to request for a visa. And well, he said, okay, if that's your wish, I'll do it. And he did. And then the visa came to me in Mexico City. And I went helter-skelter, which is yet another story, which I've written about all this in my memoirs, which the National Book Trust has brought out. So I won't go into it anymore. But I got to Vietnam. It became a world scoop. And because it became a world scoop, when I came back, the editor of the Indian Express, Mr. Malgonkar, who was the editor of editors, not so well known now, but really one of the most illustrious editors this country has known, who had always asked me to write right from the time I was 22. He gave me a women's page to edit. He somehow felt that I had the talent. And he was wanting me to write a consumer column. And he had gone out from the Express during the emergency, but when he came back in 77, he called me and said, please come and start your column again. And I said to him, Mr. Malgonkar, all this time I've been writing what you want me to write. Now I want to write what I want to write. And he said, what? And I said, I want to create a column called A Feminist Viewpoint. And that's how, on the edit page, when Indian Express had 12 editions across the country, that the Feminist Viewpoint got born and got that political space that was very precious and which pushed the envelope on many things at that time, alongside with the women's movement, which was very vibrant too in the 70s and 80s.
Chabra, I also wanted to go back in time a little bit from there and to freedom, essentially. So while freedom brought with it euphoria, there was also a sense of stagnancy, of lost hope that followed at some stage many years later. Why was that, and how did you react to it?
No, I don't think that there was stagnancy. I don't know why you say that. There was this tremendous euphoria after the independence, of course. And then we came into difficult times because we had the 62 debacle with the Chinese, which caused a lot of anguish because before that it had been Hindi, Chini, Chai, and Bye Bye. And it really broke Nehru. Nehru was the idol of our times, the icon that we looked up to. So we were disheartened when Nehru was dejected and what happened. He was betrayed and the country felt betrayed. But very quickly thereafter, Lal Bahadur Shastri came in, brought a new spirit into the country. And then each time, then Shastri died, there was never stagnation. It was up, down, up, down. There was, it was kind of, here's somebody wonderful who will do something. And then, the tragedy. And then you look to where, what now? And then Indira Gandhi came. And then, despite the wars, 65, 71, when Indira Gandhi rode, as they said, like the Durga. And, it was great. There was a woman prime minister. The world had Golda Meir all right and Sirima Bandanayaka in Sri Lanka. But Indira Gandhi was Indira Gandhi, and she really, became a very tremendous figure on the global scene. And so, the excitement in India till the emergency kept going and with great hope. And then, of course, the emergency occurred. And that was a terrible time for the media, because as Advani famously said, that, the media was asked to bend and it crawled instead, But while a large part of media just went under, we had a number of friends who were right there in Tihar. My husband happened to be sitting with Kuldeep Nair, having dinner with him the night they came to take him, and they waited because they were chatting late into the night, and so they waited for him to go. And in the morning, early morning, he waited to ring up Bharti, Kuldeep's wife, to say, I saw some suspicious looking people in a car outside your house. Just be careful. She said, but they've already taken him. They were waiting for you to go away. So, we had these um, experiences. But then I myself had an experience, which was very interesting. Uh, I came back from Vietnam, and of course, the Indian Express had 3 Sundays of its front page of the Sunday Standard, full pages of my travel from Hanoi to Saigon. There were articles that I did on the political edit pages of Hindustan Times, Indian Express. The Doordarshan ran a whole series of photographs with an interview with me. And so the NCC asked me to be guest editor for their special edition for the International Women's Year that was being brought out, and asked me to interview Mrs. Gandhi. And I had to send her a series of questions before the interview was granted, which I did. I walked in, and interestingly, this lady that was terrifying the whole of the country stood up to greet me, wished me, and said, I watched your program. I thought that was very spunky of you to get into Vietnam, and you have to tell me about it before we begin the interview. And we had a nice long chat, very friendly, very lovely. And then we did the interview. And then as the interview ended, in which I also asked her about how she balanced her personal life and all, and I said, Mrs. Gandhi, the interview's come to an end, but if I have your permission, I want to ask you something else. And she said, sure, go ahead, because she thought something more personal was coming. And I said, Mrs. Gandhi, you known as a Democrat, Nehru's daughter, and you put everybody into prison. And those of us in media cannot believe that this is happening from you. And the minute I said this person who had been so charming and gracious and chatting with me in a friendly way like you and I are doing today, suddenly her face scowled and she went into a spiel of saying which media, which journalists are you talking about, what are they doing, kind of thing. And my tape recorder was running, and it was running, and it recorded. And I just wondered when somebody will notice that it is running and that I have this outburst on tape and get taken to Tihar alongside the others. But suddenly she came back to herself, said, oh, but let that be. We have other things to talk about. And very nice meeting you. And I quietly picked up my tape recorder, punched the button, put it into my bag, and went out, rang up Malgonkar and said, I have this tape. And he listened to it. But he said, look, there's nothing new. She has said this many times before. We are all aware of it. There's nothing to be gained by your, talking about it too openly. Just keep it as a record that happened. I wrote about it in the Indian Express thereafter when the emergency had gone. And Mrs. Gandhi came back in 1980 and I interviewed her again. So, it's been an interesting.
Mrs. Chhabra, you mentioned Nehru, and there's a lot of debate about Nehru today. And so while Nehru built great institutions, there was also the socialist route that he chose. In hindsight, do you think that was a mistake?
Not at all. Not at all. I am a Nehru enthusiast, I will have to say right out front. He was the icon of our times. We didn't didn't worship Raj Kapoor or Dilip Kumar or Ashok Kumar or any of those people. For us, Nehru was the person to look up to. And I remain an admirer of him. And I'm anguished to find that there is so much criticism of him today. it is Nehru's vision and his ability, first of all, to seed all the scientific temper in the country, to build the dams and later on, yes, we found Bagra Dam had its problems, but they were at that time the new temples, and they brought a different direction. I mean, that is what helped to bring agriculture forward. He's whether you look at which institution you look at, whether it is in science, nuclear, or it is literature and the arts. I mean, he seeded everything, the IITs. He created the base, the foundation on which the country could grow. And if today we are talking about our talent and being able to get somewhere, it's because Nehru had that vision and created that foundation for this edifice to come up in subsequent years. So I don't think we should be denigrating Nehru. Rather, we should be very grateful that he laid the foundations for us. And as far as socialism is concerned, which country can prosper if all its people don't prosper? So, what is this? Socialism has been in crisis, but so is capitalism in crisis. And I think we still have. Nehru was trying to find a third way. Non alignment on the foreign side was his third way. We're coming back to it with strategic autonomy. It's different labels. But there has to be a third way where it's not the very rich, it's not the what should I say, the totally personality negating features of communism, but it has to be a third way that ensures people decent livelihoods, a way of life, and you can call it Fabian socialism by another name now.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you said all these things, because I think, but to be honest, I agree with all of these views that you've said, and I think, especially when it comes to institution building, I don't think there's been anybody better, at least in India, but probably at a global level, because let's not forget the context of the time. He's taken charge of a new country which is obviously not very economically prosperous. There's a large number of very, very poor people, and he's had the vision to build all these institutions today that we are so proud of, and as you said, on which the edifice of this country
As
rests.
somebody said, it is the most unique experiment in the world that was ever tried to
Yeah.
bring about democracy with non-violence. I mean, it's not just Gandhi in the independence movement, which was non-violent, but the whole implementation of that dream subsequently post-independence was also democracy with non-violence, and we are still democratic. That again is a tribute to that early vision.
Yeah, and however much it may be under threat today, I think the fact that we are still, by and large, democratic is a tribute to his vision.
Yeah.
But let me just change gears a bit. We fought wars with Pakistan and China, and what was war coverage like in those days? Obviously, you didn't have the resources that we do today. So, how tough was it, and what kind of coverage existed?
See, of course, you didn't have people that got embedded into the places as was happening now, or had the freedom to video from the spot. In fact, what the terrible thing that's happening today is that we've all become spectators. We are viewing war as yet another film on camera and watching it as we have our meals and have our drinks and say, oh, terrible, 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 and then go on with our lives as it is. No, I think in the old days, all this was not there. The coverage of war was very patriotic, in fact. People were very angry with what was happening. They built up the army and the air force for what they were able to do. But it was not without criticism either. There were people who brought in little leads that said, did Nehru go astray? There is Neville Maxwell who's talking about another version of how the Indochina War came into being. So, and the media did foray into criticisms also to show that there were other areas to explore. But by and large, the coverage of the wars was front-paged, patriotic, idea being to build support and to fight the battle in a way that we could come out of it victorious.
Ms. Chhabra, we already spoken a lot about what it was like during the emergency, and Mrs. Gandhi was voted out afterwards. But there was a political turn that the country took towards her again, and she was voted back in, perhaps stronger than before. As an observer, how did you perceive that change and the switch back to her?
Yeah, well, we were euphoric when she was voted out because the scenes in Ramlila grounds when Atal Bihari spoke and Jayaprakash Narayan and all the leaders, Jagjeevan Ram, the crowds poured out, and I was there in the newspaper building when the results came in of Nehru, of Indira Gandhi being defeated and of Sanjay Gandhi being defeated, and the crowds went hysteric in the roads. But the Janta government just blundered and blundered and blundered. They kept fighting amongst themselves, a bit like what you see today with the YAP and the Congress and all the others, so they're not able to put up a decent opposition voice, despite the fact that there is a problem with the BJP being, in its, as many people even say, fascist in its ideas and communal. And yet we are not able to come up with any kind of a alternative to them. So, the Janta government was a classic example of that. You had absolute lions there, and yet these big figures were not able to pull together to give us a coherent government. And by the end of 3 years, everybody was quite fed up, and Mrs. Gandhi was on the way back. And it was interesting when at that point of time, I had done a series of articles in my feminist viewpoint saying that what had happened with family planning, which was the most politically explosive issue during the emergency, was bad because even one case was one case too many. But if it came to that, the Shah Commission that was sitting at that point listening to the sins that Mrs. Gandhi had committed was not able to get more than a few score people testifying that they had been coerced. And the numbers were really not measuring up to what the talk had been. And I did a back of the envelope investigation in my own home and said, with the maternal mortality and the infant mortality that was taking place, with family planning not becoming available, what was happening to the women and children of this country was decimation. And I wrote these strong articles, including going in to Turkman Gate and talking with women there and reporting that they say what happened to us was bad, but that doesn't mean that you throw family planning out, do it in the proper way. We need it still. So I had gone into, at that point, J.R.D. Tata had invited me to come into the foundation that he chaired, a non-governmental organization, to help re-legitimize family planning with the political leadership. And I interviewed Jayaprakash Narayan, and this was shown in every cinema hall in the country, with Jayaprakash Narayan also saying that, he was anguished with what was happening to women and children and giving his support to the family planning program, which had become a phrase that nobody dared to utter in that period. So then when Mrs. Gandhi came back, she called me and gave me an interview to talk about her support to family planning, despite what had happened, and saying she wanted it done in the proper way. Not only did I interview her, but I met her many times thereafter in a private capacity, in having quiet dinners, because she suddenly felt the need to have conversations with someone who could talk back to power, but also had the pulse of the field by going around the country. So, in fact, she made a terrific comeback. And I lost my column in Indian Express because I wrote that Mrs. Gandhi coming back, now the women of the country are relying on her to do this. And of course, the Indian Express being as anti Mrs. G, as we called her, as many in the media are today against Modi, they certainly didn't want a columnist who was writing that sort of a spirit. So my column went. But it led me later to be invited by Rajiv Gandhi to come into the government to help to re-legitimize family planning across the board. And I was able to do certain things in communication. But I bring these personal stories in to tell you that my uh, disillusionment with the media is not today when people are talking about the Godi media, as they say, and then the other side is so-called free and liberal. I found, तो जैसे कहते हैं ना नेले पे देला है, uh, it's a pot calling the kettle black on all sides, because in the 90s, when we had what is called the opening up, and I, for one, have great reservations with the way we opened up. Not that we shouldn't have opened up, but the non-calibration of our opening is another story by itself that could be discussed. But we were so desperate at that time because there was no gold in India's coffers that the HIV/AIDS program that had just been forged, and that's something that I know a great deal about because I was in government just before that, dealing with those issues of family planning, reproductive health, etc. And against the best advice of all the medical experts of the country, and I was in part of those councils where we sat and talked, the government had pushed down its throat programs that eventually worked to normalize the casualization and commercialization of sex, which has broken both societal norms and has, the media, of course, jumped on it because sexualization of the media was great commercial returns. And so, under the pretext of being able to educate the public and protect them from a disease, they went bananas, doing all kinds of things that they should not have done. And you have a media that really doesn't enjoy the same respectability starting from the 90s that the media enjoyed when post-independence it was a mission, because now it was an openly commercial thing. And the opening up coincided with the opening up of the skies too. And so you had the single Doordarshan channel multiplying manyfold, with people being stolen from the Doordarshan to moonlight for these channels, including its secretary of the government being given $1 million to fight the lawyers in court because he was coming in before the time period that was the cooling off period for a senior official. So many things happened that I think broke the media in the 90s. And what we're seeing today, and where the media is now openly itself belly aching that things have gone bad, actually began at that stage. And it's taken us 30 years to really fall down the hill.
I'll come back to the media in just
exceptions, of course.
Yeah, I'll come back to the media in just 1 second. But you mentioned the economic reforms introduced by Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh. Did they take you by surprise? I'm asking because while the situation was grim, no doubt, no one expected the very entrenched license Raj to be dismantled, and that India would open up in the way that it did to the world.
Yeah, but then they were mortgaging their gold in London at that stage. And that's why I say that the HIV/AIDS program, which was offering nothing more than $1 million, which at that point was still $1 million, but still chicken feed for a country, they were able to push what they wanted as a conditionality, just to give that foreign exchange. The country was so desperate. So Narasimha Rao, I worked with Narasimha Rao, and he was the health minister and the HRD minister when I was in the government at Rajiv Gandhi's invitation. And Narasimha Rao was a master, what should I say, tactician. And, he is the one who slept while Babri Masjid was broken. And he is the one who allowed this economic reforms that are being hailed to happen without thinking through what are the regulatory mechanisms that need to be adopted to not let this become let loose in the country. we don't like to be compared to China, but we have to hand it that China also opened, but it was able to calibrate its opening in a way that it was, you may not agree with their system, but they opened in a way that suited their system. We did no such thing. We've been hands up.
Right. And so, just coming back to the media, and you mentioned that many of the ailments that we are seeing today in the media actually have their roots in the 90s. How do you view the media's performance in today's political and social scenario? And there's been a lot of debate about its capitulation to the Modi dispensation. Some believe it has, some believe it hasn't. Uh, are you among those who feel that the news media have failed us in this time, or do you think they're doing fine?
My book says it all, because when I say journey into the media and out, it says my disillusionment, not as of today, but published in 2012. So, I really don't know how else to answer that question to you. I think so much is wrong with the media. They're good people. They're good people there. But exceptions, and by and large, vulnerable, because you've broken all the systems that held the media in place, so that it was not as if there were no battles between the commercial interests and what was the editorial independence in earlier years. You had George Verghese being shooed out of Hindustan Times, given his uh, marching orders on the staircase, as they said. You had things like that happening. But you had men of gumption who were able to stand, and men only, no women were there, but men of gumption who were able to stand up and say, to hell with it. I work on my terms. And secondly, it was the media had mechanisms. There was the Journalistic Wage Act. There were institutions. There was a press council with more teeth than it has now, that you could go to, that you could appeal for regulation if injustice was happening. There's no longer anything there. You have and journalists were not on annual contracts. You got a job into an organization. So, there is a lot that has gone wrong with the media. And so even the few and far between people who want to work in it as a mission are unable to do so. And the commercial interests have now dominated. If government interference is bad, corporate interference is as bad. And the role of the media really was to keep equidistance. It has not happened.
What's your view of the digital revolution that has transformed the media landscape?
Again, the digital divide has accentuated the other divides in the country, for one thing, because you have the have-nots becoming more of have-nots, because the digital instruments are not easily in their reach. But my biggest grouse, and I come back to myself all the time because I'm fighting these battles still at the age of 86. I continue to say what I can, where I can on some of these issues. But for the last 30 years now, I have been saying to the government at all levels, and in the last few years, written letters to the Prime Minister, to the Information Broadcasting Minister, to the IT Minister, saying, you're going from 2G to 3G to 4G, and please watch again, calibrate, because when you get images into this country and you do not do something about regulating pornography, what you are going to get is the worst kind of material unleashed on the most unsuspecting, audiences who've never been exposed to this kind of thing. And there's going to be mayhem in the country, which it is. I think the women and children of this country are paying the price for this digital openness that we're talking about, without it having been regulated, for blocking off what is totally objectionable. Now, I have to make the point that I am a person who fights for freedom of expression for political purposes. So what my whole argument on this has been that you cannot conflate pornography with freedom of thought and expression, and that it is most important to realize that the internet, which is governed by the First Amendment of the USA, cannot be the ruling force in this country's where the Constitution has Article 19, Clause 3, which says reasonable restrictions, including for public decency and morality. So we are, as I say, being colonized in a different way altogether. And I sort of go back to Amitabh Ghosh's books, which have documented so dramatically and so eloquently that whole opiumization, as I would say, of the Chinese society, which took them 2 centuries to come back from. And it happened with trade wars when opium was pushed onto that country. And I call the pornography that's coming to us on the internet, which I'm told now is almost like 66% of the traffic of the internet, is another opium.
Before I go on to other non-media related topics, I know you said that you don't want to talk too much about your time in Vietnam, but do you want to tell us very briefly about what happened there, that there was a 2,000-kilometer road journey before we proceed?
As I told you, I went from Vietnam, and I got the visa information there and went helter skelter. And of course, first thing was that I was supposed to arrive in Vientiane on a certain date, and I arrived in Hong Kong en route, and the previous night, and everybody looks at my ticket and tells me to come in at a certain time, and I arrived there an hour before, and they tell me the plane has taken off. And it was a once-a-week flight to Vientiane. And there was I, without any money in my pocket, actually, and stranded. And I stood in the Hong Kong airport shouting, "Stop that plane. I have to get onto it." So from that kind of a drama where they thought I was a mad woman, and eventually caved in because I threatened to sue the airline for $1 million and showed them my permission to come into Vietnam. And they realized that that was something. They managed to fly me to Bangkok and then fly me back to Vientiane, and I got there. So, to cut a long story short, I arrived on Hanoi to find myself being welcomed by a group of women in Audais and lotus flowers in their hands who said, "You're a state guest, Mrs. Chhabra." And this happened because the foreign secretary had sent off a letter, and India, because being the chairman of the Indo-China Commission, had played a sterling role in Vietnam in being very neutral and guiding its political destiny very effectively during the years. So they thought if the foreign secretary is writing, she must be somebody politically connected. And so they made me a state guest. and our ambassador acting ambassador in Hanoi, who came across to meet me and briefed me that they are allowing some communist journalists from Russia and from Cuba, Czechoslovakia, to travel. So there are teams that are now going, but they are strictly from their communist world. So the next day I had a meeting scheduled with the foreign minister of Vietnam. And when he asked me, welcomed me, and he said, "What can I do for you, Mrs. Chhabra? What else would you like to do?" They had, of course, laid out an elaborate program. And I said, "Sir, the only thing I want to do is to go to Ho Chi Minh City." And his jaw dropped. And he said, I was 104 pounds at that time, looking as fragile could be. And his jaw dropped, and he said, "But madam, I cannot see you going because it's, there are no roads. It's very tough. We're just coming out of the war." And it was the wrong thing for him to say, because I said to him, "I'm just coming from Vietnam, sir, where we've given a standing ovation to the women of Vietnam and for their role in the war. And you're saying that I can't take a journey." So he stood up and said, 4:00 tomorrow morning. And so I was on. And I had for my companions 2 Cubans, each of them weighing under 200 kilos, and a Czech who was 6 feet 4.5 inches. And they looked at me and said, I could see the thoughts running in their mind, this pain in the neck, through this long journey, this is going to be terrible. And it was terrible. We were in jeeps that were, I've described it as bronco ride always, because the roads were really hardly there, and we, bumped up and down on those bridges that were not there, and had to be ferried, and stayed at war camps en route. And but the communist journalists would obediently go off to their tents at night, and I would sort of quickly have a bath and come out and start wandering around, to the great consternation of the Vietnamese, who were not used to this kind of disobedience. And I had people following me and holding on to me, and I was very irritated. But then I later not realized, but later came to know that they were as horrified that I was wandering around, because there were mines all over the place. And they thought that the state gas could be blown off if I wandered too far anywhere. But I was desperate to just look to see what I could do to write, and somehow to be able to do it. So anyway, I mean, I did that 2,000 kilometers in a very difficult circumstances. And in fact, eventually from Ho Chi Minh City, brought the India's diplomatic bag so back to India, so that the people had information that their people were all right and things were good. Front page for 3 weeks. So, I've already talked to you about the response I got. And then the world, the New York Times, Guardian, Dagens Nyheter, Der Spiegel, the Australian, I mean, you name it. They all carried my travel, because nobody had gone.
Ms. Chhabra, I want to talk about your non-journalistic work too. And now you've been advisor and additional secretary in the Union Health and Family Welfare Ministry during the Rajiv years. You already mentioned that. You also been a UN fellow at the International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City. You mentioned that.
Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, not UN. Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India.
That was, I think, as a additional secretary, right?
Additional secretary.
Yeah. No, I'm also saying you also been a UN fellow at the International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City.
And then I was a delegate at the Nairobi Women's Conference.
Correct. The UN Mid-Decade Women and Media meeting also in New York and so on.
Yeah.
How did you get into that? Tell us a little bit about the work.
No, I mean, all that is, see, the women's issues I've talked about, I've been writing. And so it was a natural that from Mexico City, one would get to the New York conference, the Nairobi delegation. But the Ministry of Health was, because as I told you, I got invited by J.R.D. Tata to come in to work with this foundation to help re-legitimize family planning with the political leadership. Then I interviewed Jayaprakash Narayan, I interviewed Mrs. Gandhi. I was very much in what was supposed to be a 2-year project, went into 8 years of my working on family planning. And in fact, I started writing less and less because it was so time consuming. And I was trying to develop projects across the country rather than writing any longer. And then Rajiv Gandhi invited me, because I was very critical of an attempt that was being made at that time to bring the advertising agencies. They disbanded the entire family planning communication setup. Not disbanded, but the people were there, but they how should I put it? They squeezed the complete funding to those people, so that they were there, but they had nothing to do. And they wanted to bring the advertising agencies to work on family planning. And I had been called in on an expert group. I had already been a part of the Joshi committee, which looked at software for Indian television. Now I was brought on to an expert group that looked at this family planning communication that the advertising agencies were proposing. And I was amazed to find that there were astronomical sums being asked for, and the kind of programs that they were putting across was ludicrous, to say the least. And I said this, and I said it's a ripoff. And as an expert in the committee in the INB. And to my amazement, the next day, the Prime Minister, who happened to be at a function that the foundation for which I was working had organized, came to me and said, "So you think the advertising agencies are doing a rip-off?" Overnight, he had heard about this outburst that I had had in the ministry and taken note of it. And then a few days later, I was rung up by his secretary, Sarla Garewal, who said, "The Prime Minister wants to see you. Please send your CV." And it was a Sunday. And I said, "Madam, I'll send it to you tomorrow morning from the office." I reached the office, and there was Mrs. Garewal several times on the phone wanting the CV. And I said, "It's being typed. In those days, you didn't have the computers. You didn't." I mean, I had no idea that I had to give a CV. But to, again, cut a long story short, she finally called me without the CV. And I landed up there because she said, "The Prime Minister's waiting." And I walked into the Prime Minister's room for him to say, and she had asked me the previous day that I'll warn you, we were wanting to make you an additional secretary. And I said, "I really don't know what I can do in that role. I'm not fit for that. I'm not an administrative person." And so he had also got that information. So the minute I walked into the Prime Minister's room, he came forward and said, "Rami, I didn't think you were the kind to chicken out of a challenge." And that was it. I shook his hand and said, "Mr. Prime Minister, you have me on." And he said, "Yes, I know they'll make chicken out of you, the bureaucrats. But don't worry, I'm here. And if you have a problem, you can always come." Of course, famous last words. Once I became an additional secretary, the protocol, shutters came down. I could never meet with the Prime Minister, and the bureaucrats did give me a rough time. But I was able to do two things that I do need to want to talk about because they relate to the media. I took a stand that the advertising agency's work had nothing to do with me. And they had brought me in hoping that I would clear up the mess for them, the bureaucrats that had created the mess. And I said, "Sorry, it's your mess, you do it." And absolutely resolutely refused to deal with that subject. I brought them in instead on a completely voluntary basis. And in fact, I turned the whole family planning communication from being a patronizing adventure and two, a propaganda tool, two, being a beggar's bowl which said, "Come, this is your problem as much as it's mine. See what you can do for it at a no profit, no cost, basic cost basis." And secondly, broadened its horizon on communication to include all kinds of issues of women's interest. And when I failed to get the ministry to work with the advertising agencies, give them time to work on a voluntary basis, I set up a studio across the corridor in my own office, commandeered a producer from the Doordarshan, and we brought out a series of 1-minute spots that have actually created a communication revolution because you now have social messages coming, which date from that time. And I got that 1 minute of time given to me meaning the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, without payment to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Doordarshan, arguing that Doordarshan was there to pursue such national interests and not for any other reason. And the Public Accounts Committee not only backed me eventually on this, but called the then DG Doordarshan to task for not being even more cooperative. So it was a wonderful, what should I say, breakthrough in communication that occurred that time. But unfortunately, it never got the mileage that it should have got because we managed to make a dent. The surveys showed that my spots were reaching on dot. But after I left, the whole 90s, the commercialization wave came in. And actually what I had set out was to show that the government itself could do for a fraction what you were asking outside, and that it could be done well, was really not wanted. It was then, quietly put aside, and the whole commercial interest prevailed all over again.
It's a familiar story, actually, in many aspects of government.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about one very important issue too. And we have a very serious problem when it comes to political representation of women. Even today, the Women's Reservation Bill is not a reality. Now, you have been active in the space of women's causes, as you've so eloquently detailed today. Do you have any hope at all that the bill will eventually be enacted, and how do you overcome the hurdles it is facing today?
You touched upon another point that I fought on all my life. My very first article in Feminist Viewpoint was that unless women's political representation is there, the women's perspectives will not come. And in fact, I have argued for a different strategy to enable women's political representation before parliamentary standing committees. And it was, in fact, at one point of time when the bill was in a crisis, because the Women's Representation Bill went into parliament on many, many occasions and was the first time when standards broke in parliament and you had free for all going on. It occurred over the Women's Representation Bill. Reservation bill. I call it representation. It was called the reservation bill. But I have been, because of my background with population, I was arguing from 2000 that the delimitation is going to take place. And while you are having people arguing that there is a lack of democracy because the constituencies have become so large that there is no parity of vote now in the constituencies. And on the other hand, you have the north-south divide because the southern states were, as they are now, anguished that they were going to lose out because they were doing good work, that the delimitation exercise offered an opportunity to create a thrust for women's representation alongside and solve the dilemma. But the women's movement didn't understand delimitation. They thought I was going bananas. And the political forces were actually not interested in the women's issues in any case. So, and then eventually, when I did manage to get to speak to the standing committee, and Nachiappan, who was the chairman at that point of time, actually came back on a second occasion and asked me to present the strategy to them, because what I talked about was building double member constituencies. Then, because the delimitation had gone, but I said, if you can now, because your constituencies have become absolutely elephantine, 1.5 million, and I've done tables that showed 2.5 million, 3 million, it's good. How are you going to ever get out of money, muscle, power if you have this size? So double member constituencies, which really went back to what we had when we were newly independent, and which we had lost only because of, again, another political issue that had us do away with double member constituencies, because Vivi Guri, who was then not the president at that point of time, but had lost elections in a double member constituency, fought to get that happen. So there was a precedence for it. My last attempt was a monograph that even now brought out that what could be done with the same strategy, which I actually presented to the vice president 2 days before this bill came into parliament. But he was very, what should I say? I should not use any wrong word. Nowadays, the media gets blown. But the vice president was very careful, and he did not let out on what was happening. Took 100 copies of my monograph to say that he would distribute it. And then they went into parliament to bring in this bill. So now to come back to your question. I don't see it happening because it is when the census takes place, and when the census takes place, when the delimitation takes place, and thereafter the committee is constituted, which will say which constituencies go to women. We know that the last time the delimitation had to be postponed because the north-south, drama was very dramatic. And it's already started. It will be even more so this time. And the South will be even more fearful because the North has become even more populous and the numbers are even more astronomical now of what the winners and the losers will think. So I have been saying that this is non sequitur, the bill. And the government, and unfortunately, I sent my monograph to many leaders of the opposition before, whether it was Kapil Sibal or it was Jairam Ramesh or it was, you name it. None of them spoke up to say how will you implement this? Everybody did a rah, rah, rah. So everybody claimed this is our thing. We wanted women's reservation. And they brought the bill in. But I don't see it happening.
That's
And it's so sad.
very, very sad. I mean, it's ironic that in India we don't have it, but when Afghanistan first threw off the Taliban rule and you had democracy there, they started off with the 25% reservation in parliament. So imagine Afghanistan in those days did it. Of course, now they've lost democracy and the Taliban is back, but we still don't have a women's reservation. But anyway.
No, and I mean, my whole point was that if you brought in double member constituencies, you needed to recreate the Gandhian ethic in these constituencies with what I call the feminine political perspective. So that, just as Satyagraha was a non-violent tool that became a powerful political tool, but was based in the psyche, the feminine psyche, non-violence. And so the way Gandhi was able to politicize and also energize all the women in the process, it was a second opportunity to do this with double member constituencies, which would kill many birds with one stone. But we didn't buy it.
So, Ms. Chhabra, let me change gears again. Now, you've written books, you've held so many positions in government, you've done so much in the media. What's next for you?
Oh, no. I mean, I don't think there's anything next now. I've done my bit. I keep saying every time I've done it, and I don't want to do anything more, and then something happens, and I join the foray once more. Fiction I did want to write. I've written it. I hope people will read Becoming the Storm. And as I said, it's not only a nostalgic look at an era that's gone, and not many people know it. Just as you were interviewing me today saying not many people know the media as I have known it over the years, and therefore can speak with authenticity. The same way, the Delhi that I described in the 50s and 60s is a Delhi that very few people today will know. And so I thought that was worth recording. The kind of exchanges, the kind of relationships that existed within the Punjabi family at that point of time. But I also wove into it all these issues that I have been deeply involved with, because I mean, early marriage, again, I was one of the first to bring out a paper which I sent to the Planning Commission telling them that their analysis on demographics was going astray, because they were talking of only births and deaths, but they're forgetting the Napshlayakti factor. And that if we could only delay marriages and delay them in the way that China had done and Southeast Asia had done, with not unwed pregnancies and free-for-all going on, but with social restraints and sexual restraints in place for the young, we would be able to do much more to build a generational gap than it could be with a contraceptive revolution. So I have written these papers in 1978, 1980, and so I've returned to that theme, not to the Planning Commission, but now to the people with easy prose and a storytelling art to say early marriage is not good for a woman. It puts her into a lot of troubles, and she has to have a lot to fight it through. And then she's exposed to all the dowry claims and the domestic violence that occurs when she wants to speak out on her own. So in a way, I have brought the socially political issues right there in the front in the novel. But from what I can see from the reviews, people have found it readable. And I hope with your podcast, you will get more audience for it.
Fingers crossed. So, Ms. Chhabra, that brings me to the last question. This is a question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
Why do I do this work? I don't think it's work. I don't look at it as work. It's life. I have written always because I wanted to write, and I've never written to order, but I've written about what I believed in and found space eventually, somehow or the other, for the thoughts that I believed in. So, I mean, when earlier years one worked for a pittance, one worked because one wanted to work. Now, when money has also come with the work, I've always said to myself, my goodness, and they pay you for it too. I love it. That's all I can say.
Ms. Chhabra, it was an absolute delight. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All Indians matter.